Hello learners, welcome to this session on the topic Ethical Guidelines in Counseling. With this session you will complete your module 2. So let us just recapitulate what you have learned till now. You have completed your module 1, that is on Introduction to Counseling Psychology, and module 2 on counseling process. As part of module 1, you learned about what is counseling, the meaning of professional counseling as we use it in counseling psychology, how it needs to be differentiated from other uses of this term in different settings. You also learned about the different types of counseling, mainly focusing on educational counseling, career counseling and personal social counseling. And you also learned about who is an effective counselor, like to be an effective counselor, what all educational qualifications are required, what kind of trainings are required for being a professional counselor. So also what are the personal qualities that are required for becoming an effective counselor. Okay. So you learned about all these qualities and professional training that is required for becoming a professional counseling psychologist. Now, as part of module 2, you learned about how counseling occurs, that is about the counseling process. You learned that there are mainly 5 stages in which the counseling process occurs. However, these stages are not rigidly sequential in nature. We can say that they are dynamic in nature and there can be going back and forth between these stages. Also, further you learned about the various factors that can affect the counseling process. And these factors are related to the physical setting in which counseling occurs, factors related to the process of counseling itself that also might impact the counseling effectiveness, and also factors related to the counselor as well as the client related factors. So all this must have by now given you a broad understanding of the meaning of counseling as we use it in the field of psychology. Now, what happens in counseling and what do we require if we want to become a good and effective counselor? So an important aspect of becoming an effective counselor is understanding the ethics that govern a particular profession. Counseling as a profession has its own ethical principles and guidelines to be followed. Ethical conduct is very important in many, in any profession. If you take, ethical aspects are very important because it gives credibility to that profession, and also it helps in the growth of the profession, and it develops trust for the practitioners of that particular profession. So in this session we will talk about ethical guidelines in counseling, with which you will complete your module 2. So let us see what all we will discuss in this video. First, you will learn about what is ethics, the meaning of ethics, the importance of ethics, and then we will talk about the purpose of ethical guidelines and also the principles of counseling code of ethics. And then finally, you will learn about various ethical standards of professional counseling. So let us start with what do we mean by ethics. Ethics are important in any profession. However, in counseling profession, it is more so because, as you know, counseling profession, it involves a counseling relationship and the interaction between the counselor and the client. So it needs to be governed by certain standards and regulations so that it can create a therapeutic climate in the counselor-client relationship, because this therapeutic climate is very important for the effectiveness of counseling, and also it develops trust and confidence on the counselor. So ethics basically provides a philosophical foundation related to the conduct of human beings, that is how to behave and how to interact with others in different settings and situations. For instance, Kitchener, if we take his example, Kitchener has defined ethics as making decisions of a moral nature about people and their interactions in the society. So ethics, we can say that these are normative in nature, that is they prescribe how do you how you are required to behave. they prescribe different ways of behaving and regulating oneself in a professional context. And also they prescribe various principles and standards that regulate and govern the relationship between the counselor and the client. The word ethics is also used synonymously with morality. Okay. Because you might be confusing what is morality and what is ethics then. So morality, though these two terms are used in a similar manner, but morality basically refers to what is good and what is bad. In fact, both these morality and ethics refer to what is good and bad or right and wrong, because they deal with human conduct values. However, they differ also. Ethics are more normative in nature because they consist of standard guidelines. They prescribe different guidelines as to how to behave or conduct oneself in a professional setting. Whereas morality, it is based on judgment and evaluation of action. So now you must be clear about what is the meaning of ethics. Let us see, why do we need ethical guidelines in counseling? What is the importance of ethics in counseling? Now, ethics are the backbone or the foundation of any profession. They help the profession to grow and advance and develop credibility for the profession among people. So, counseling as a profession, it has various ethical responsibilities and obligations. A central aspect in counseling is the counselor-client relationship, which is also called as an alliance between the two. And this alliance or the relationship, it is characterized by mutuality. Hence, it also needs to be therapeutic in nature. And for this, it is very important for the counselor to practice ethical guidelines in counseling. Let me further explain you the importance of ethics in counseling by taking two examples here. For example, we know that each individual, they have their own belief system and values according to which they behave or they take decisions in their life or they function according to their belief system. So, counseling relationship also, it involves two individuals. The counselor is there and the client is there, and thus each of them, they would have their own value system, they would have their own belief system. If the counselor is not aware about the client's values and beliefs, then they may not interact with them in an effective manner. Counselor's beliefs may also affect the client. It may happen that during the counseling situation, the counselor may persuade the client to change their beliefs and the way they behave by saying that, okay, this is a correct way of behaving or these are not correct way of behaving. So, and the counselor might expect the client that the client should behave as per the counselor's ways or the counselor's belief system. So, this kind of interaction in the counseling situation, it might harm the client in this counseling process, and the client may feel invalidated in the process, and as a result of which the client may lose trust and confidence in the counseling process itself. So, it is very important that the counselor needs to know the ethical standards, the regulations that govern this counseling profession. They need to be aware of their own values, judgments, their attitudes towards different things, their belief system, so that they do not impose these on the client. Because the client has their own belief system. So, if as a counselor you are going to reject the client's belief system, then the client in the first instance will not be able to develop trust on the counselor. So, that is why it is very important the client needs to feel validated during the counseling process. So, as counselor, you need to know how to conduct yourself in a proper way when you are interacting with the client during the counseling process. So, it is important. That is why it is important for the counselors to know about what are the professional ethical guidelines that they need to follow during the practice of counseling. Another example we can take here, that counselors need to have good communication skills. Counseling is also known as talk therapy, and it mainly involves talking to the clients, and it requires definitely good communication skills. So, we can say that good counselors are also good communicators, but the vice versa may not be true. That is, all good communicators may not be good counselors, because you can see here that apart from good and effective communication skills, counseling requires much more, including the ethical conduct. For example, if you take the salespeople or the politicians or those people who are working in the public field or media and advertisement sector, they need to have good communication skill. But their communication is geared towards persuading the other group or the other people. So their objective is to influence other people, to direct them to change their thoughts and behavior in the intended direction. Whatever we want them to follow, the person will take actions accordingly. So counseling is not simply effective communication, it needs to make use of the ethical principles also. As a counselor, our purpose of communication is not to influence the client or not to advise the client or impose our own belief systems on the client. Here we are not going to persuade the client or the other person or a group of persons to adopt a certain way of thinking or to change their behavior in a certain way or develop their liking for something. Okay. You might have noticed many advertisements gearing towards this end, that the advertisements want the stakeholders or the certain group of people to adopt a particular way of thinking or adopt a particular product. But in counseling, the objective is not to influence, but because you must be remembering that it is an alliance between the counselor and the client. So it is characterized by mutuality. The objective of communication in counseling is to help the person to develop an alternative perspective. Counselor helps the client to reflect on their existing patterns of thinking and behavior, and this helps develop insight into their problems or any kind of suffering they're going through or any kind of issues. So it helps the client to find their own solutions, and they're able to deal with their stress or anxieties in more effective way. It enables the client and it makes them more empowering so that they can take their own decisions or make choices and adjustments in a more better way, in a more effective way. So all this requires that the counselor functions in an ethical manner and keeps the good of the client in mind. That is, the welfare of the client should be the top priority. They should not be harmed in any way, but their benefit and the welfare of the client should be the top priority. And their values and beliefs need to be accepted and acknowledged rather than outrightly rejecting these and imposing the counselor's beliefs and values. Because as you see, the core of professional counseling and effective counseling is the trust for the counselor and the unconditional positive regard for the client. And practice of ethical guidelines will ensure the establishment of trust, rapport between the counselor and the client, and it will bring authenticity to this counselor-client relationship, and this will lead to effective counseling. Now let us see what are the purpose of ethical guidelines. There are different purposes of ethical guidelines that are followed in counseling. First of all, it provides a framework for effective functioning in the profession. Okay. It provides a structure, a framework to the entire counseling profession so that one can conduct oneself accordingly. It also clarifies to the counselor what to do and what not to do, so that it provides different guidelines to the counselor as to how to conduct oneself in a counseling situation. It also provides regulation for the profession. Okay. And as a result of this, it prevents misuse of the profession or exploitation of the client or harming the client during the counseling process. And as a result of all this, we can say that these ethical standards or ethical guidelines, it promotes professionalism in the practice of counseling, and it helps in addressing the ethical dilemmas or resolving the ethical dilemmas that may arise in the counseling practice. These ethical standards also protect the professionals, that is, it protects the counselors also in case of any legal issues. So as a result of which we can say that the ethical guidelines, it ensures the well-being of the client as well as the counselor. And finally we can say that these ethical standards, it promotes the best practices in the counseling profession. So as you see here, the main purpose of having ethical guidelines in counseling profession is to ensure the well-being of both the client as well as the counselor, and to promote professionalism in the practice of counseling profession. This will enable the growth of the profession itself, and it will increase the credibility and value of the profession. Now let us see what are the principles of counseling code of ethics. Ethics in counseling are based on 5 principles of counseling. These 5 principles are beneficence, non-maleficence, fidelity, justice and autonomy. Let us briefly describe what do we mean by each of these principles. Beneficence refers to doing good for the client. That is, it aims towards well-being for the client based on professional assessment. The goal or the objective here is to have the best interest of the client in mind and act accordingly. The client enters the counseling relationship because they are not able to solve their problem or the issues, or they want help in their growth and modify their beliefs and behaviors. Hence, it becomes the counselor's responsibility to ensure the well-being of the client, especially if the clients are vulnerable or young, or they are undergoing severe stress and they are not capable of understanding the situation. So there it is the role of the counselor as well as the obligation on the part of the counselor to act in the best interest of the client. So thus it requires that the counselor needs to be competent and trained to deal with the client's issues and problems. So the second principle is non-maleficence. So what do we mean by non-maleficence? It refers to causing no harm to the client. In the first principle you saw that is beneficence, that is doing good to the client. Here non-maleficence means that causing no harm to the client. So in addition to ensuring that good is done for the client, the counselor also ensures that no harm is done to the client. This principle ensures that the counselor doesn't engage in any kind of intention or action that may increase the risk of harm to the client. The importance of this principle is that the counselor must avoid any intentional and even unintentional thought or act that might cause harm to the client. For example, physical, emotional or sexual exploitation or abuse to the client. So the counselor needs to take care that there is no harm done to the client. The third principle is that fidelity. It refers to being trustworthy. That is, counselor needs to be trustworthy to the client so that the client develops trust and confidence on the counselor. Because unless the client is able to trust the counselor, proper rapport, which is very important for counselor-client relationship, this proper rapport will not be established and counseling may not be effective. Because as you, if you recall, there are different stages of counseling, and the first stage was rapport establishment in the counseling process. So it is very important that the counselor should win the trust of the client. Now, ethical standards that follow fidelity is maintaining confidentiality that will help strengthen the trust of the client on the counselor. So it is the duty of the counselor to maintain confidentiality of the counseling process. Now, another principle is that justice. So justice refers to being just and fair to the clients, their needs and their well-being. It doesn't mean treating all clients in an equal manner, but it can justify if different treatments are required for different clients. Thus, it ultimately ensures fairness for all and it doesn't discriminate between clients. It ensures that respect is provided to the client and the dignity of the client is maintained irrespective of their different backgrounds. So, you can see here that final principle, the fifth principle of counseling here is autonomy. Autonomy principle indicates the freedom of the client to choose and act. Since the client seeks counseling, it doesn't mean the counselor has the upper hand here and will direct the client to choose and behave according to the counselor's wishes. It doesn't bind the client that they will have to follow the counselor or uh, uh, do not question the counselor. So, autonomy encourages clients' self-directedness to act independently and think what is best for themselves. So, that is why the counselor-client relationship is called as an alliance marked by mutuality. For example, as you have learned in the video on stages of counseling, the counseling goals are decided mutually, and also what strategies to be followed to achieve the counseling goals. Now, as you see here, these are the 5 principles on which various ethical guidelines or ethical standards are based on. Now, let us see what are the various ethical standards or guidelines, the specific standards or guidelines that need to be followed during the counseling process. The first of it is informed consent, which refers to the consent taken from the client regarding participation in the counseling process. The client needs to give consent, that is, the client needs to agree to come to the counseling situation, because many times it might happen that there may be reluctant clients where the clients are referred to the counselor. So, in that case, the client may have the willingness, may not have the willingness also. For example, in the school situation, if you see, the school counselor is there, the teacher might refer the student to the counselor, but the student may not be willing to come to the counselor. So, it is very important that the informed consent needs to be taken from the client, that the client should consent for participating in the counseling process, and this consent is taken in the beginning itself. This is also called as informed consent because as counselor you provide the client all information regarding the process of counseling. For example, the duration of the counseling, the number of sessions that might be required, and the role of the counselor as well as the client, and what are their responsibilities, the counseling fees if any. So, like this, all types of information need to be provided to the client in the beginning itself, so that the client is informed and the client is able to take a decision based on these information. They are also free to quit counseling at any point of time during counseling. It is important that the consent given by the client is voluntary and it is not done under any pressure or compulsion or force. Another ethical standards is confidentiality. Here all the things shared by the client with the counselor or expressed in the counseling situation, they need to be kept confidential by the counselor. This is important for building the trust and rapport with the counselor, because the clients share their innermost feelings, anxieties and frustrations and other type of emotions with the counselor, with the trust that these will stay within the boundaries of the counselor-client relationship. Hence, the counselor needs to maintain confidentiality of the transactions during the counseling situation. However, there are certain exceptions to confidentiality also. For example, when there is threat to the client, like the client may harm themselves like suicide or threat to others, maybe the client may cause physical harm or kill others, or in case of child abuse, or in legal cases also when the court requires you to share things about the client. So, in these cases you can breach the confidentiality. So, that is very important to note here. Now, another ethical standard is privacy. Counselor-client interaction should not be disturbed by any other person or the surrounding factors. So, this also is very important to keep in mind, that while providing counseling to the client, it should not be that your mobile is ringing or there is any kind of background noises or surrounding noises or disturbances are there. So, as a counselor you need to maintain confidentiality as well as privacy of the counseling situation. Another important guidelines here is record keeping. Counselor should maintain proper record of the data about the client and the interactions with the client. Here care needs to be taken to ensure the safe upkeep of the data and also protecting the data from falling into wrong hands or misuse of it. So it is the counselor's ethical responsibility to maintain the privacy of the data or the record about the client. Another ethical standard here is the client's welfare. The welfare of the client should be the priority of the counselor and the main objective of the counselor. There should not be any harm to the client. Also, self-care of the counselor is important. In addition to the welfare of the client, counselor also needs to take care of their own needs and care for themselves so that they maintain their own well-being and they are fit to provide service to their clients. Okay. Because counselor, when they interact with so many clients with different kinds of problems or issues or sufferings, that might impact the emotional aspects of the counselor and harm might impact the well-being of the counselor. So it is very important for the counselor to take self-care and maintain their own well-being also, so that they can provide proper service, effective service to the client. Another ethical standard here is counselor competence. Counselors should have proper professional competence, including adequate training and supervision, so that they can do justice to the client while providing counseling. They should also be well versed with the legal aspects of the particular country and also the ethical conduct in the counseling profession. Okay. Because the counselor might function in a multicultural setting also. So, in different cultures there might be different belief systems, different ways of functioning, and if the counselor goes to another nation or the country, they might have different legal standards. So, it is very important for the counselor to have knowledge about the legal aspects of the concerned country also. Here I would like to mention that the American Counseling Association has prescribed professional and ethical standards for counseling profession. It has 8 main sections which focuses on different aspects of counseling profession. Section A, it is the counseling relationship. For example, during the counseling relationship, there should be no harm done to the client. The counselor needs to think in terms of the good of the client. Section B, it talks about confidentiality or privileged communication and privacy. Okay. Section C, it talks about professional responsibility. Here, the counselor competence that I talked about comes here. The counselor needs to be properly trained to provide counseling to the client. Section D, it talks about relationship with other professionals. Okay. And because when you are practicing as a counselor, there will be other professionals also in the same profession. So you need to maintain harmony or cordial relationship with the other counseling professionals. Section E, it talks about evaluation, assessment and interpretation. Section F, it talks about supervision, training and teaching. And section G, it talks about research and publication, because as part of being in the counseling profession, you can also engage in various kinds of research and publication, and there are ethical guidelines related to how do you conduct research, because you have to take the client data there. So the confidentiality issues also will come up there. So there are ethical guidelines related to research and publication also. Then section H, it refers to resolving ethical issues. So as I said, there might come situations where there might be ethical dilemmas. So how to resolve these ethical dilemmas, about these guidelines are also included in this ACA Code of Ethics. So at the end, to summarize, in this video, you learned about the importance of ethics in counseling, the meaning of ethics, the 5 main principles that govern ethical guidelines, and various ethical standards that need to be practiced in counseling profession. So with this, you completed your module 2. In the next video, we will start with module 3, that is assessment in counseling. So till then, happy learning.